We're in a series in the book of Esther. Esther's a unique book. We're learning about God providentially providing for his promises. Providence is God's activity throughout history in providing for the needs of human beings, especially those who follow him in faith. And that's specifically important to recognize. The book of Esther is a great encouragement to us because, like maybe your own life, you might say, I just don't see God's fingerprints in my life. I just don't see him working. He seems absent from me. Well, especially to you then, because the book of Esther does not include God's name, though we see him working. And that's what we're looking for in the book of Esther, to see different spots where we can see God putting things together. Last week, we got a backstage pass, a behind-the-scenes look at the story of Esther. We were introduced to 4 characters of the story: the king Xerxes, Mordecai, Esther, who the book is named after, and then the unspoken character, God, who is actually the main character in the story. And the main point that we looked at was that God is working even if you can't recognize his handiwork in the moment. We often see it hindsight as 2020. But today, we're going to see how God positions people for his purposes, right? I appreciate you sharing some of those unique jobs you had. But I'm hoping what that does in your mind is trigger the different positions that God has put you in over the years. Most importantly, thinking about the ones that you have today. And just not your employment, but maybe also your stage of life. Maybe married, unmarried, children, no children, grandchildren, different stages of life. Maybe volunteer, maybe retired, maybe full-time missionary, maybe employed. But these different positions, these areas of influence that God has placed you in, whether you recognize his handiwork in that or not. I remember a unique job for me was being a sweet corn picker. Your hands get kind of raw when you pick sweet corn all day long, but you can learn how to pick a really nice ear of corn. Now when you go to the store, there's no ear that sort of measures up any longer in this state, but maybe I'm shopping at the wrong places. I remember being a dock worker as a young man, making $12.50 an hour. I thought, man, I'm just rolling in the money now. $12.50 as an 18-year-old, you don't know what to do with it. But I don't know where it all went either. Right? Amazing how that happens when you're young. There's also ones that are a little more painful. Like, where is God's handiwork in your first pastorate lasting 3 months? Maybe you've got some of those in your past. You say, what was the purpose of that? Positional purpose in those ones. We're going to dive into the book of Esther. We didn't finish chapter 2. So if you turn to chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 21. And we're going to start there. And we're going to take little bits and portions, make some observations, make some applications, and then draw a conclusion here at the end. Esther chapter 2, verse 21, and quote, "During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And then the report was investigated and found to be true. The 2 officials were impaled on poles." That's an exciting thing there. "All this was recorded in the book of Annals," or you may have in your Bibles the book of Chronicles, "in the presence of the king." Now, that ends chapter 2. And what we should be expecting at this point is to find out in chapter 3 how the king is going to honor Mordecai because Mordecai has saved his life. That should be the next thing we're going to read about, especially in this culture, how the king will now honor Mordecai. In this next chapter, we're going to be introduced to the 5th character of the story, Haman. And we're going to learn a few things about Haman. Interesting phrase that starts off chapter 3. On the NIV, it labels it this way: after these events. After these events, the commentators say it's about 4 to 5 years that take place from the end of chapter 2 to the beginning of chapter 3. So, we're going to see that Mordecai's good deed seems to have been forgotten, seems to have been unrewarded. You ever felt like that? Did the right thing, but it wasn't even recognized maybe. Maybe you feel like it was forgotten in life. There was no reward just yet. Worse than that for Mordecai, just not is he not honored, but honor is given to Haman, introducing the second conflict we find ourselves in. The first conflict was between King Xerxes and his wife, Vashti. That was the first conflict in the story. The second one is going to be between Haman and Mordecai. So, verse 1 of chapter 3 as we go in here. After these events, about these 4 to 5 years, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than all that of the other nobles. That's where we want to read Mordecai. We would say, reading the story, Mordecai deserves that position, but it's not given to him. Verse 2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. We've read this before in the story, right? Enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, in the month of Nisan, the poor, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different than those of the other peoples, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." On the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned, and they wrote in the script of each province in the language of each people along Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles with the various peoples. These were written in the name of the king Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to kill, destroy, and annihilate the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king had Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. We learn a few things about the character, the fifth character, the character of Haman. I'd like to point them out to you first, that he's an Agagite. Okay? That is, he's a Amalekite. Okay? He's an Amalekite. We were actually learning this in Sunday school, where the Amalekites come from. They actually were to be destroyed. But one person slipped through, and so there's still Amalekites in this time of Esther. There's a long feud going on between these two groups of people, between the people of God, Israel, and the Amalekites. So he's an Agagite. The author wants us to notice that. If you were a Jewish reader, you would see that, and it would alarm you. Okay, that this is the person as an enemy. Secondly, we see him manipulating the truth, lying, exaggerating, for one reason or the other. If you look at verse 6, we see an indicator here that when he learns that Mordecai is a Jew, it's just not good enough to kill him. He wants to kill the entire race. Okay? There's racism going on here. And so then when he goes to talk to the king, he sort of applies all that's true of Mordecai to the entire Jewish people, saying, hey, look, they keep themselves separate. Their customs are different. They don't obey your laws. It's not in your best interest, king, to tolerate them. Okay? So he's applying all that's maybe true of Mordecai and more to the king. And just not that, just not does he lie, but he also bribes the king. The history books say in those 4 to 5 years between chapter 2 and 3 that King Xerxes suffered a very big loss in a war. And so likely his treasuries were rather depleted. And so it would be very fitting to take a bribe. Interesting he didn't. But it does go to show the character of Haman, that he would offer this money in verse 9. He offers 10,000 talents of silver to go in the royal treasury. So there's the character of Haman. All right? Not one to model after. Enemy of Israel, liar, and briber. Now Mordecai is supposed to be the one getting the honor, but rather here Haman gets the honor. And Haman is enraged, just not past homicide of one person, but now into premeditated genocide of the whole Jewish people. And it shouldn't surprise you that King Xerxes, in his lack of leadership, just like in chapters 1 and 2, shines through again here, making him the key accomplice in this genocide. Gives the signet ring over. Whatever you want, it's yours, pretty much. He's not ruling as king any longer. Haman is, in some ways. And so ending the chapter with the king and Haman here, they're feasting on wine. They're getting drunk. We've seen that before and decisions that come from that. Meanwhile, do you notice where the people are? It's interesting to see this at the end of the chapter. They're getting merry in spirit, the leadership of the nation. Meanwhile, the people are bewildered. They're in turmoil. They're troubled. These men are disconnected from their nation. So that's what's going on in chapter 3. Now, as we've been journeying through Esther, we want to take a look at different ways that we see God working behind the scenes. Because we believe that God's providence provides his promises. And the book of Esther is a true life example, though the Lord's not mentioned in the book directly, that God is providentially providing for his promises. It'd be through these Jewish lines that Christ would come. And so we need this line to stay true. We don't want the Jewish people to be erased from the earth. So if you look at verse 23, chapter 2, verse 23, the very end, okay, it appears, like I mentioned to you, that Mordecai's good deed goes unnoticed, unrewarded, uncompensated for. The one that's supposed to be getting honor is Mordecai, and he's not. You need to know that's not the way the whole story ends. Okay? Because when we get to chapter 6, verse 1, we're going to see how important it was that it was recorded in the book of Chronicles so that the king would read it later. So we see God's handiwork there. when you get to chapter 3, then, what we just read in verse 7, all right, we see Haman, and we see Haman casting lots. This would be dice. And what he's attempting to do is determine the day that the gods, okay, will honor the slaughtering of the Jewish people. That's what he's trying to find. What is the favorable day for this genocide? Now, that's the way he's going at it. But from a Jewish perspective, Old Testament theology, we would know what? That he's just seeking idols, which aren't true gods. That there is one true God, okay, almighty, all-powerful. And this wisdom would come to mind as we're reading this. It's from Proverbs 16:33. 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." Okay. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. That's an Old Testament theology of God using the casting of lots. Even more obvious, maybe not for us, but for the Jewish readers, when they're reading this book, they're reading this book every year during the Feast of Purim, okay? You're going to see that later on in chapter 9, verse 24. It's an annual feast. When they read this, they're going to be reminded by the word Pur, from which the very feast Purim gets its name from. And so when they read into this, they read about the Purim, they're thinking about the casting of lots, and they're thinking about how God guides everything, even lots casted into the laps, like the proverb says. And so that's just a reminder that God is even in this casting of lots, even though he doesn't know that it is the God. He's trying to seek the gods to find his favorable day. The third one then, this is just 3. You've got chapter 2, verse 23, chapter 3, verse 7, and then chapter 3, verse 12. Chapter 3, verse 12. I didn't see this. Commentator pointed out to me, okay? The day that the edict was given, all right, the day it's being pronounced would have been the day before Passover. The day before Passover, okay? Now think about this. The day before Passover, you know it's coming. But one day, your faith is challenged. I mean, to the core. You are going to be annihilated. The next day, you've got Passover, where your faith should be reassured by what God had done in the past. You might even have things like that in your life. Things get messy. But you can look to the past and say, I know God will take care of me. I've seen it. We were in Ecuador. Cesar made mention that when it comes to funding the water projects, it doesn't take much faith. Why? Not that he doesn't have faith, but he's seen God do it over and over and over and over again. So one day faith challenged, the next day faith reassured. It's a reminder for us to see the providence in our own lives as we see it here in this true story, the real life example of Esther. Now moving on from that time, the edict is given in chapter 3, where there's the pending annihilation, to the date of chapter 4. Maybe I should reword that. From the time of the edict to the day that they would be annihilated is about 11 months. Okay? About 11 months. From the time they're told, hey, Jewish race is going to be wiped out, to the day it's going to take place is 11 months. So, when we step into chapter 4, we don't know exactly when this is. There's an indicator because it's as soon as Mordecai learned of it. That could have very well been that day, the day before Passover, could have been later. But when he learned of it, that's when we step into chapter 4. I want us to look for what actions we see them taking. We know from the story that Mordecai believes in God, that Mordecai believes the promises of God. And so how is it that Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people, how are they going to react to this situation? Will they just brush it off? We know our God. He's promised a line of David. We know Christ will come. So We don't need to worry. We don't need to do anything. What will these people do? That's what we want to look at as we go into chapter 4 here. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict had ordered the order of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hadok, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what had been troubling Mordecai and why. So Hadok went out to Mordecai in the open square in the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened, including the exact amount of the money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. He told him to instruct her to go to the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hadok went back to report to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for many men and women who approach the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back an answer. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Then Esther sent his reply to Mordecai. "Go gather all the people who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink. Go for 3 days, 3 days, night and day. And in my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So, will she perish? Will the golden scepter be extended to her? Well, you have to come back in 2 weeks to find out. Okay. Next week we have our prayer and praise service, so please come excited to share your praises of what God's been doing. And also we'll spend some time in prayer together for that service. But it's interesting here, we've got Hadok going back and forth, liaison between these conversations. I wonder if he got fed up with it. Just wanted them to talk face to face. But it's interesting, this record that goes on and on as they actually begin to take action. And so I have here in your notes a line that says, "Living life while believing the promises." You see, Mordecai says in verse 14, "If you remain silent at this time," in other words, Esther, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. You see, Mordecai is living life believing the promises of God. Specifically, we would say he's believing the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 17. What we wanted to look at is what actions does Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people, what actions do they take? Knowing the promises of God. The Jewish line will not be wiped out. God has promised this. Do they just, for the 11 months, take a back seat? Do nothing? Just pray about it? What do you do? What do you do in life? Because this is our situation too, right? We believe the promises of God, and yet this is a real life story. Well, I think there's some instruction that we can take from what's going on here. First off, you can see that there is an expression of real emotion. Verses 1 through 3, okay? Mordecai, though he believes the promises, all right, he knows the Jewish line is secure, he doesn't act like everything's just hunky-dory in life, okay? Things are not hunky-dory for him. It's going to be 11 months, all right? It's not hunky-dory. And he expresses this. He goes out wailing, right? I think what we need to see from this is for the Christian, it's not contrary to experience genuine emotion and yet trust God and his promises. It's all right to have those expressions of emotion. It's part of the way God has made us. We also see that they plan. Verse 4 to 14, the bulk of chapter 4 is Mordecai and Esther planning. They don't use God's promises as an excuse to be lazy. They don't take a back seat. They're thinking about, how do we join God and God's will in this? How do we use the positions that we have to join God in what he's doing on the earth? We would say, how do we use our positions, whatever influences we have for God's kingdom work now and today? They're doing the same thing. It's not contrary to trust God and make plans to join God's will on earth. And then third, we see them seeking God. We should seek God, verses 15 to 17. You see, Esther, she's not putting all of her trust in her plan. All right? That can be easy to do. Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, they all point us not to trust in our own plans, but to entrust ourselves to God. And so that's what she's doing here. She's entrusting really herself, her very life, to God. She understands another wisdom principle found in the book of Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 9. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. There's times in life, you may have experienced some of you worse than others, some of you more than others, where you experience at the same time both bewilderment, like the people there, and the security of God's promises, right? And this is a real life situation that we're reading about here. And what's interesting is to watch how Mordecai and Esther, they're living in a familiar scene that we can relate with in some fashion. They're living as exiles in a foreign land, and so it really sets up a way to live with a heavenly citizenship under earthly governments. A heavenly citizenship under earthly governments. Just a few things to take a look at. In chapter 2, verses 21 to 23, where we started, you might have asked yourself an interesting question. Why did Mordecai save Xerxes' life? Right? I mean, King Xerxes basically is a glorified human trafficker. That's what we learned in chapters 1 and 2. This king is not a nice king. You even have an indicator later on where he's out drinking with his buddies. Meanwhile, the whole nation's in turmoil. He's not a good king. So why doesn't Mordecai just let him be assassinated? Well, Mordecai embodies what Jeremiah prophesied in 29, verse 7. He said this, there was instructions here for what to do when you're carried into exile. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper. Seeking peace in a foreign land. That's the way Mordecai was operating. Seeking to have peace. Now, he probably also knew that murder was wrong, right? Obviously, he's going to know murder is wrong, so he's not going to have a hand in that. Even if he gets wind of it, he's going to want to bring it to light. He does, which is good. He should not allow, as wicked as Xerxes is, to be assassinated, he should go in, as he did, and get that news to the king. So that's one way, one example that we see in Mordecai here, how to live with heavenly citizenship under an earthly government. The next one is, why doesn't Mordecai honor Haman? Okay? And what's the big deal? What's going on here? Why does he refuse to honor him? This is from chapter 3, verses 2 through 4. They ask him multiple times, okay? More than one day. They're trying to interact with Mordecai, say, hey, why don't you honor the king? Exodus 23 says, you shall have no other gods before me. You see, for Mordecai to show that kind of honor, to bow down to Haman, would be an act of idolatry, would be to worship Haman. He understands a principle that we worship God over government. It's easy to get that reversed, as politicized as our cultures are. But as the people of God, we worship God over government, not vice versa. Got to keep that in mind. And lastly, we see an example that if our faith does land us in hot water with the governing authorities, that we're going to accept the consequences, as Esther is willing to do. Chapter 4, verse 11, we realize that she is willing to accept the consequences of law. If that golden scepter doesn't come out, she knows she will be executed right there on the spot. She's willing to accept that. That's the consequences sometimes for getting in hot water with earthly governments. Something our brothers and sisters around the world know way more than we do. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17, I think is an awesome verse. It really sets up for the New Testament Christian just a way to conduct life with people. It says, show proper respect to everyone. Why do we do that? Because everyone is what? Created in the image of God. All right? So we do that with everyone. Next, then it says that we are to show respect to everyone, love the family of believers. All right? It's not that you ignore other people, but it's not because you have blinders on. Rather, it's because you're focused on your brothers and sisters that you do this. And then it says, fear God. Fear God. We talked about the problem that King Saul came under because he feared man. He admits that. Fear God. And then it says, honor the emperor. Honor the emperor. But listen, if push comes to shove, we fear God more than we fear the emperor. The emperor may kill the body. This life ain't it, right? That's the New Testament world view. So as we seek to live with heavenly citizenship under an earthly government, we also keep in mind 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 2. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for the kings and all those in authority. Why? That we may live peacefully and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. It goes back to that Jeremiah principle, how to live as an exile in foreign land. On your handout there, where you can see that the sermon title is Positional Purpose. Positional Purpose. Had you identify some of the unique positions that you've had. I wanted you to acknowledge the different positions that you have now, currently. Many different positions, just not what you do for a job, but where's your areas of influence? All sorts of influence in this room, right? If we were to plot out the world and able to go to each person one by one and say, here's where this person has influence, and put a little highlighted mark where they have influence around the world, I think there'd be a pretty remarkable highlighter marks on this globe, on this church body. Very unique, right? It's probably good that we're not all in the same position. Agreed? Not all focusing on the same spot. You'd rub right through the globe, right? Wear people out. But God's given us different positions. He has us influencing different places. And that's very intentional. He's got purpose in that as we scatter all week long. In verse 14, there's this phrase that you've probably heard. Maybe you didn't even know it came from the book of Esther. where Mordecai says to Esther, and who knows, he's not, he's alluding to it, but he's not, full force with it. Who knows? Okay, Lord's will be done, maybe a similar phrase. But that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. That she has this position intentionally for this time. That her position has purpose. That God providentially provided this position to Esther for this purpose of a saving of a nation. Possible. Very possible. We'll learn as the story goes on. But let's think about Esther's position. Okay? You may have been able to relate with some of the hurts of walking in a world, right? Where sometimes things don't go as planned, as you planned. And what do you do with those? What is the purpose in those? Think about Esther. Esther's parents died. Okay? No mother, no father. So she's adopted. She's adopted by an uncle. Sometimes, to prepare a position, other people have to be moved on. That was the very first conflict in chapters 1 and 2 with Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti had to be removed so that Queen Esther would be put in place. It's a result of her being put in her position. And a principle for all, maybe especially, look at the fact that Esther's physical beauty got her introduced to the king. There's a principle there, right? Esther's beauty is what got her introduced to the king. And even Xerxes' evil desires motivated him, but ended up that the crown is put on Esther's head. Good things. Things that we say were not so good things. And God using them all providentially to provide Esther's position for his purposes. So we see it in Esther. You also see it in Mordecai. It's easy to pass over, but actually this in Mordecai may be more familiar to you than the story of Esther. Back when we first started, the very first verse, you might have wondered, why did we stop at verse 20 last week? Here's why. Verse 21 starts off, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gates. And you read it and you go right by. Well, wait a minute. Why is he there? Why is Mordecai there? You see, God is providentially providing Mordecai's position sitting at the king's gate. Right location, and maybe you've recognized this in life, right time. Right? Especially with interacting with people. It's just not the right place, but the right time. We say that in Mordecai's life. And because he hears this assassination plot, ends up being recorded, and we're going to find out later how that ends up providing for him a providential position. So God, without causing evil, without violating our free will, God works to provide positional purposes. We see it with Mordecai. We see it with Esther. We see it with people all around. If you look closely. So I have some questions for you. As we think about maybe a theme verse of Esther. Who knows? But that you may have come to your position for such a time as this. So you've thought about the different influences that you have. Very simple. Question 1. Are you using your position for his purpose? The influences that you have, do you use them for God's purpose? If you think of your main influence and you are thinking of your employment, then are you working unto the Lord? Something to think about. It's going to play out differently in each of your lives because there's a very unique swath of employment represented here. Right? different influences based on your season of life, what God has you doing. Second, if you would say, yes, Brian, I am using my position for his influence, for God's influence, for what he's doing in his kingdom work right now, will you continue? Today should be an encouragement to recognize that. I want to encourage you to continue. And if you say, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe I'm just going to work the docks for $12.50 an hour and going in, punch the clock, coming home. It's kind of nice. Don't have to talk to anybody. Just do my work. In and out. Well, for you, maybe would you consider starting using your position provided by God for his influence? Then lastly, can you identify a current? You may be able to see times in the past. Those are typically easier to see, though even some of those might be painful. Can you see a current for such as a time as this opportunity in your life? Is there something that's been on your heart? Has somebody approached you with an opportunity? Has a son tugged on your pant leg? Different opportunities in life. Are you looking for, can you identify a certain current for such a time as this? If you do, I think you should take your cues from Esther. I think you should go for it. Okay? You should go for it. This whole series, we're attempting to see God at work in a book where he's not named. Sometimes life feels like that. But I want to encourage you as we looked today, we saw 3 areas where we see God working things providentially out for his people, for his positions, for his purposes. That over the past 2 weeks, today's sermon, last week's sermon, and the 2 sermons that are coming, that maybe in your own life, be able to start to see God's fingerprints in your life a little easier, watching him work. And maybe specifically today, maybe it's a small opportunity, maybe it's a big opportunity, I don't know. But that you would acknowledge, with the areas influences that you do have today, the ones that you will wake up to Monday morning, whatever day that is for you, that you would acknowledge that God has providentially provided that position for you. Even if that includes some hurts from the past. Maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not so obvious, but that you would walk in life that way with positional purpose, believing God's got opportunities for you as you go about your weeks. Let's stand and pray together. We're going to sing a closing song. We're going to go out of here looking for those opportunities. We're going to wake up and think about that verse in Esther, verse 14. Father, for some of us that are here, maybe it is easy. Maybe you are obviously working, and they would be able to say, this is it. Such time as this is the opportunity, and it's glaring, it's obvious. Lord, we pray for faith that they would walk through that. But Lord, for those who would say it's not so obvious, I kind of feel more like the book of Esther. I couldn't pin down, here's chapter verse, here's year and day of when God did this and God did that and God did this and God did that. It's led to this position. But Lord, that we would acknowledge that in the Christian worldview as a sovereign God, that though you don't cause evil, you'll use it. And though you don't violate our free will, you use that. And you're working everything out sovereignly to put us in what we see here, positions of purpose. And Lord, that purpose right now is to build the kingdom of God, to be an ambassador, to be a professional reconciler of people to you. Father, it doesn't really matter what we're doing, what influences we have. We can do that. And so, Lord, I pray we would take heart, even in the small glimpse of verse 20 of chapter 2, that Mordecai, that you had him at the right place, at the right time, just to hear something, just to have an interaction with people that were talking. Because, Lord, maybe life is a little bit more like that for some of us. But that we would, in that moment, acknowledge, this isn't chance. This isn't just casting of lots, but we serve a sovereign God, and so it's not just happenstance that I'm here, at this place, at this time, with this person. And that we would take that opportunity. Lord, thank you so much that you give us purpose in our positions, and that we've got the opportunity to serve a living God as you build this kingdom on earth. May we join you, may we make plans, may we pray, may we join you in your working in this world this week. Amen.